Space opera has been a subgenre that goes way back, nearly 100 years, but some members in the science fiction community have used it as a pejorative. It seems like everyone has their own definition. So, I want to take a closer look at the elusive subgenre of space opera because I am Daisy Ex Machina, the drag queen detective that investigates all things speculative in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. The term space opera can be traced back to the 1930s, being associated with comic strips like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. But it was also called a space western because many of the stories followed the formula of westerns. Star Trek was pitched as a space western to Lucille Ball when she was head of Desilu Studios. Heck, Star Trek wasn't called the Final Frontier for nothing. And there's even an episode set in the OK Corral called Spectre of the Gun. The term space western isn't really used any longer, at least not in the original sense of Flash Gordon. If you go to a bookstore and ask for a space western, you'll probably get recommended something like Upright Women Wanted by Sarah Gailey, which is a science fiction set in a Wild West environment. In addition, the term is associated with soap operas, which are melodramatic stories wrapped in a science fiction setting. For me, when I think of space opera, I think of soft science fiction, where the science part isn't important, but it is set in space, and maybe there's lots of planet hopping, but at least part of the story involves battles with spaceships. The example that everyone uses, and maybe it's the apex of the space opera, is Star Wars. There really is very little science in that science fiction story. In fact, the Force is purely fantasy magic, even though there was an attempt to put a scientific spin on it later in the series, introducing microorganisms called midichlorians that give you the power of the Force. I personally prefer the Force to be a more spiritual power, which was how it was first presented. But in Star Wars, we get lots of melodrama.
I am your father.
Lots of planet hopping. And lots of spaceship battles. One of the most exciting moments in Star Wars for me are the space battles. And stories that narrowly focus on space battles are often called military science fiction, which is a much more specific subgenre and probably more useful. I say useful because the whole point of subgenres is to help audiences find similar stories. And since people use the term space opera in so many different ways, I wonder how useful it is. In fact, I know of one booktuber who maintains that a space opera is a story set in space, which I think is really broad. But is it accurate? I recently read a book called Splinter in the Sky by Kemi Ashingiwa, which was marketed as a debut space opera, but very little of it was set in space. I'm not sure if it is useful as a subgenre term, since it doesn't help you find similar books. Do you go out looking for a space opera when shopping for a book or a movie? Let me know down in the comments. And while you're there, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I don't know, using Star Wars as a template for movies, there are many that you could group into the category of space opera. Battle Beyond the Stars, a really bad 80s movie, by the way, tried to capitalize on the success of Star Wars by using the Seven Samurai as a storyline. The Seven Samurai was, of course, famously remade as a true Western in The Magnificent Seven. The Last Starfighter was another 80s movie, which actually I thought was super fun. It's about a teen in a trailer park recruited as a spaceship fighter pilot by a galactic federation because he was so good at video games. There's Battlestar Galactica, a franchise that started in the 80s as a group of spaceships on a diaspora to escape the evil Cylons, which was rebooted in the 2000s as a much more successful show. More recently, The Expanse, which was a fantastic book series by the writing duo that went by the pen name James S.A. Corey, became an excellent television series started by the Sci-Fi channel and finished by Amazon Prime. There probably is an argument that The Expanse is more hard science fiction, so it doesn't fall into the space opera category, which is fair enough, but it had its fair share of melodrama, space battles, and the story was truly epic. The world building and plot kept expanding and expanding the further you got into the storyline. Get it? The Expanse? My absolute favorite, however, is Babylon 5, the groundbreaking science fiction show in the 90s created by J. Michael Straczynski. Straczynski, by the way, is also the executor of Harlan Ellison's estate, which is interesting, but besides the point. Anyway, Babylon 5 won multiple Hugos for its story about a space station called Babylon 5 run by the Earth military or government, but is also kind of a United Nations sort of hub for alien nations, which includes some of the most interesting alien races ever, the Minbari, the Centauri, and the Narn. I really appreciated the theme of chaos versus order as opposed to good versus evil. When it comes to books, the subgenre, at least for me, feels a little fuzzy. Sure, you get Star Wars-inspired books like the Star of the Guardian series by Margaret Weiss, which even has her own versions of lightsabers called blood swords. And if you look for military science fiction, you can't go wrong with the Honor Harrington series by David Weber about a spaceship commander with an alien cat companion. More recently, Red Rising by Pierce Brown can be described as a space opera about a Roman-inspired far future where the society is highly stratified and the hero of the lowest rank, a red, rises to the highest rank, a gold, to start a revolution. The second trilogy, or book 4 and on, however you categorize it, is pure military science fiction. If you like brutal, graphically violent, truly horrendous space battles, these books are for you. What's remarkable to me about Pierce Brown's writing is it is so florid and ornate, like you'd imagine how ancient Romans would speak, contrasted with really crude language. Seems like it should be really pretentious, and it shouldn't work, but it does. At least it does for me. My absolute favorite, however, actually puts the opera in space opera, and that's Stephen Donaldson's Gap cycle, made up of 5 books: Gap into Conflict, Gap into Vision, Gap into Power, Gap into Madness, and Gap into Ruin. It is basically a retelling of Wagner's epic opera The Ring Cycle, which I'm sure, if you don't recognize by name, you would by the music. They are very adult novels with sexual degradation and assault, which Donaldson seems to like to write about. It is raw and visceral and probably needs all the trigger warnings you can think of, all of them. I know Donaldson is known for the Thomas Covenant Chronicles, but I think the Gap cycle is his best work. And there are some people that put some pretty well-known books into the space opera category, like Frank Herbert's Dune, Asimov's Foundation series, Ian Banks' culture books, even Hyperion by Dan Simmons. But my favorite and most explicit definition comes from Sir Brian Aldiss, a Grand Master of science fiction who edited the anthology called Space Opera. He made up a list of specific criteria which he says most, if not all, must be contained in a story to make it a space opera. Number 1, the world must be in peril. Number 2, there must be a quest. Number 3, a man or woman must meet the mighty hour. Number 4, that man or woman must confront aliens and exotic creatures. Number 5, space must flow past the ports like wine from a pitcher. Number 6, blood must rain down the palace steps. Number 7, and ships launch out into the luring dark. Number 8, there must be a woman or man fairer than the skies. Number 9, and a villain darker than a black hole. And finally, number 10, and all must come right in the end. For me, just for me, I personally don't find space opera very useful as a subgenre. If I do see a story with the space opera tag, I will expect an epic, melodramatic, soft science fiction story, but it's not a subgenre I go out looking for. What about you? Let me know down in the comments. Also, let me know if there's any other subgenre of speculative fiction that you want to know more about. Until we meet again, may all the books you read be blessed.